I'm not going to give you a slide talk, I'm going to give you a talk with a slide. And I'm going to give a talk that's partly based around the title of the Venice Biennale, which I think is the reason that I was invited here at all. And I'm not doing this in order to sort of promote my brand as an exhibition maker, but to talk about why that title was chosen and how it sits in relation to some other issues in the larger world. I should say it's interesting partly because this year's Venice Biennale has a very, very different premise. I don't know how many of you have seen it or have read about it, but it's a well-made show by Massimiliano Giorni, who's an Italian curator, the youngest curator ever to do the Venice Biennale. But the main fare in the Biennale is work by artists who are quote-unquote outsiders, or in the old terminology, art brut. Work by artists whose real common denominator, basically, is that they are not something else. And I should say that the terms outsider and art brut being the nomenclature of Jean de Buffet, meaning art in its raw state, outsider being a definition in relation to the insider, that all of these things are definitions by negative inclination. They tell you, again, what things are not, and almost nobody is happy with them. Now, there are great many artists who fall into the category of art brut or outsider art who are unaware that that's the category they've been placed in. And some of those who are aware of it are not very happy about it. But we know from art history that almost none of the major movements that we have were named by the people in them, and almost nobody who was in them by association is happy with the nomenclature. In fairness, Solowit wrote a series of sentences and then a couple of paragraphs on conceptual art, which are brilliant pieces of writing in which anybody in the art should read. And he embraced the term conceptual art, and a certain number of people who practiced conceptual art embraced it as well. But the Cubists didn't want to be Cubists, the Fauvists didn't want to be Fauvists, the abstract expressionists didn't want to be abstract expressionists, and the minimalists didn't want to be minimalists. So that being put in a category of outsider art or art brut is an unwelcome designation imposed by people who are mostly curious, if not hostile to that kind of work, rather than by people who embrace it. And I'm not going to get into a long discussion of outsider art, particularly now, because that's not really what I want. But I'm using this as a point of reference, and I'm using this Biennale and my Biennale as sort of dialectical pairs. But in any case, if you think that art brut and outsider art is mostly defined by what it's not, it's worth considering what that thing that it isn't is. And in the case of de Buffet, again, he published a manifesto, actually it was a lecture given at the Arts Club of Chicago in 1951 called Anti-Cultural Positions. And it was an essay which was very, very influential on the history of art. It was done in English and in French, republished in French, it's in his collected works. But among the people who heard it and heard it loud and clear were artists like Leon Golub and Nancy Spiro, and a lot of the artists who created the Chicago way of making art in the 1950s and 1960s. It has its resonances in the work of people like Jim Nutt and Bashki and others. And the whole notion, again, was that culture somehow was a bad thing. That culture somehow depleted art. That culture somehow was the overlay of a conventionalized establishment taste, and that what one needed to do to reinvigorate art was to deculture it. To take away all those layers, to take away all those conventions, and find some kind of pure strain of creative intelligence, creative drive, and creative need that was untainted by culture. Now, we do know, by the way, that de Buffet was a very successful wine merchant. We know that he was a very successful conservative painter in a neoclassical mode before he became an artist. We also know that the Arts Club of Chicago is one of the most genteel places in the world for the discussion of art. Although it's a very good and important place, it is very genteel. So it is significant that the anti-cultural positions are voiced by highly cultivated people in highly cultivated places. And that the anti-art quotient of art brut and of all the associated outsider things is in fact there because the people who embrace it are embracing it in contradistinction to something that they also are deeply embroiled in, if not very happy with entirely. So we get into those contradictions, and indeed, this year's Venice Biennale promotes the idea, in not so many words, but certainly by example, that the art that matters is the art made by people who are antisocial, or at least unsocial, who are driven by deep private inspiration, but not necessarily learned or trained, and that what art is that solitary activity of individuals who are inspired, as opposed to people who make art for reasons, and with understandings of conventions, and with knowledge and intent and programmatic desire. Now, before getting into this too much more, I will just double back on Mr. Lewitt. Lewitt's sentences on conceptual art are altogether, I think there's 60 of them. Somebody in the room maybe can correct me whether it's 50 or 70, but in any case, there are a lot of them. And they're quite prescriptive. And they say basically, do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that. And one could read the second through the last and think this is a person who only makes art by formula. This is the very antithesis of spontaneity, the very antithesis of creative urge. It's the first sentence that really counts, and then the next couple thereafter. The first sentence says, conceptual artists are mystics. They leap to conclusions that reason will not take them to. And the next several say, conceptual artists are not formalists. Formalists repeat themselves according to a programmatic idea, as opposed to the conceptualists who make this initial leap. And therefore, all the rigor that goes into his way of thinking about conceptual art comes after a premise which has to do with the power of intuition. But allied to that power of intuition is method, immediately. Now, the basic way in which people tend to talk about outsider art or art brut and so on and so forth is that it is an art without method whatsoever. It is art with a drive. It is art with a necessity that is inchoate, largely inarticulate except in the work itself, compelling to the person who makes it, compulsive to those who look at it from outside, and that it is something that had to happen the way that it happened, but not necessarily that a critical intelligence operated on it. It's almost art in spite of itself, or helplessly created art. Now again, these are big statements that I'm making, and I know that there are qualifications to be made as well. But I'm talking about the way these ideas float around in the larger world, not necessarily about what Dr. Prinzhorn or a serious psychoanalyst of culture would say about Mr. Wolfley or any number of other people. Henry Darger, for example, now is a popular figure. When I was coming up in Chicago, Henry Darger was a person who was of intense interest to about half a dozen artists, including a couple of them who actually ended up with an awful lot of his work because nobody wanted it. Now you can't have it for love or money, or you can have it for money, but an awful lot of money. But in any case, this revival in a new generation, and Massimiliano Gioni is under 40, I think, this revival of interest in art brut and outsider art has to be seen, I think, as a cultural shift where a series of actually quite old ideas are being revived by people to whom they seem fresh, even though the basic intellectual and critical content of it isn't fresh at all. Again, if you take Dubuffet's position as being one of the clearest articulations of it back to 1951, but already the work of Dr. Prinzhorn and others who were developing the first collections of outsider art go back into the 20s, and people like Max Ernst and Paul Klee studied this work, teens actually, studied this work as a predicate to what they made. But now you have a number of younger artists, younger curators, younger critics, going back to this notion that there is some kind of strain of pure creative energy that we can tap into. And that this energy, if expressed without any kind of dilution or overlay, is preferable to what it is that is done by people who are conscious of the conventions in which they work, who consciously embrace conventions for the sake of doing that work, and so on. Now, I'm going to move to John Cage very quickly, but I'm trying to set up an argument, as I think you can imagine. And I'm trying basically to say that I question this altogether, although I understand where it comes from, and I'm more interested in the cultural phenomenon of its return than I am in the truth value of any of these assertions, since I don't think they are true. I think that art brut is of great interest. I think it is often made by people who are not brutes at all. It is, in fact, often made by people who are very much in line or part of the time in which they live, the culture in which they live, and that one of the interesting components of art brut or outsider art is how it is that people who are, in fact, obsessional sort through the material of their culture differently than those who have other kinds of agendas. So, to give you an example, a man who's of great interest to me, Louis Sauter, who was a cousin of Le Corbusier, the architect, was borderline in many respects, and the creator of many, many wonderful drawings, fantastic drawings. There's a book that's recently come out, a facsimile book, of a text on modern architecture. I think it's actually a text by his cousin, Corbusier, but it's a text that he illuminates around the margins with these wonderful, wonderful drawings, which looked kind of like 19-teens American newspaper cartooning allied to Gothic, right? And they're wonderful, fanciful things. They're full of erotic jokes and full of architectural jokes and so on and so forth. And Sauter was a man who was clearly highly intelligent, highly educated, highly a man of his culture, who also had it on a tangent, took it on a tangent. Louise Bourgeois, with whom I worked for 30 years, is another example. Louise was a woman who was inside and outside of her own consciousness all the time. And she read extensively, had seen everything, knew everybody. She could not have been more enmeshed in modern culture, modern art, modern history. And yet at the same time, she had fugue states, she had panic attacks, she had a whole lot of things that pushed her over a line psychologically. So the way that that material recombined and became available to her, the reasons that she made the work that she made out of desperate fear, and the only way to sort of appease that fear was to make something, that is different, right? Now, you can't talk about Louise as if she were an uncontrolled, uncontrollable, creative drive, dynamo, whatever it is. But you can't state either that she was a traditional artist of the kind like many of her modernist peers. She didn't work like Marcel Duchamp, whom she knew very well. But on the other hand, she didn't work exactly like somebody like Wolfley or whoever it is, no, certainly not. She was more like Louis Sauter. And there are a lot of people in this category who are working inside and outside of a self-conscious, disciplined idea of art, and also in ways that break those paradigms because of contingencies and necessities very different from the ones that most people who pick those conventions up are involved in. Now, Lewitt opens the category on the grounds of mysticism, but I'm just opening the category on another level, of a psychological necessity, if you will. Mysticism and psychological necessity aren't so very different, in fact, but they are different to a degree. In any case, that we are having now all of this kind of backlash against an art of considered, critical, intellectual rigor, as another swing of a pendulum which just keeps on swinging since the beginning of modernism, a pendulum which basically chooses either-or propositions. Either one makes art according to a set of predetermined, considered, often collectively considered rules to remake the world, or one makes it based on a sort of absolute individualism of creativity. And if you want to think about the first option, you have Gestalt, Bauhaus, Constructivism, and so on, where groups of artists, men and women, got together and figured out what the new world should look like, and what the basic linguistic components of art should be, and how it is that they should be stripped down, purified of previous conservative tendencies, and then deployed to make a new language for the arts visually, and to make a new world out of that new language. That's one contingency. Another contingency, again, is the retreat to individual insight, inspiration, what have you, which is expressed by expressionism, by surrealism, by abstract expressionism, and so on. Now, the truth of the matter, of course, is that none of these movements are quite that simple. Johannes Itten, for example, among the Bauhaus people, was one of the mystics of art, one of the mystics of color. and thought about these things in quite different ways, as did Kandinsky, as did a number of other members of the Bauhaus genus. They were in the sort of mystical, transcendental mode, even when they were being most rigorous in some other respects and most playing the game of lawgiver. And the other side of the coin is also true. William de Kooning was not spontaneously expressing himself. Willem de Kooning had, by training, over and over and over again, rehearsed the disciplines and rules and image-making modes of classical art. And he was a past master at it. If you look at his early drawings, you will see amazing sort of virtuosic use.
Did you say his name again?
Willem de Kooning. Willem de Kooning. He's upstairs. And you will see amazing demonstrations of neoclassical drawing technique. At the Modern, there's a painting called Woman 1, which is the dissembling or dismantling of that model. But it's done by somebody who could do the real deal in his sleep. And in fact, Bill in his later years would sit in front of television with the sound turned off and draw without looking at the page. So he was distracted by what was on the screen, and he would draw, and what you see in these drawings is the wealth of knowledge about how to draw the figure coming out of somebody who is deliberately distracting himself from looking at what he was doing. Now, I'm using him as an example because there is a sort of nice, not nice, but a complex set of relationships here, which I wanted to sort of pull forward. One of the shows I did when you were there, actually, was the de Kooning show, late de Kooning show at the Modern. And these were works that were made by de Kooning when he was already in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, and possibly, of course, Korsakoff syndrome, which is an alcohol-related dementia. The work that he made was breathtaking in all kinds of ways, but runs against the idea that it could be the authorial work of that artist, because presumably he was in the throes of some kind of complete possession, if you will, by psychological factors that were beyond his control. And there were also the questions of whether or not what de Kooning was doing was really art, or whether or not what was being done in the de Kooning studio was really de Kooning, or whether it was in fact art made in the de Kooning manner with the assistance of assistants that more or less took over the process. So in the context of all of this, I called up Oliver Sacks. And I said, listen, let's walk through a show that was taking place at the Met when I was involved in organizing one for the Modern. Let's walk through the show and talk about what you see. And it was a very interesting excursion because we went through the show, and when we got to the late 70s, early 1980s, which was the onset of whatever condition he had or combination of conditions, you could see the change in the work. And the question was the change in the work a change brought on by illness, or was the change in the work a change in the work that he made even as he was becoming ill? Because there's a big distinction between my condition and who was struggling to figure out how to make color works where he used just simple color squares. And John told him basically, why don't you just scatter them, just roll the dice, do the I Ching, whatever it is, and take a process which circumvents logical decision-making, composition in the ordinary traditional sense, and create something by virtue of the arbitrary. But again, this is very much like Solowit. It's the leap of imagination that then goes into a process. And so in MoMA, there's a painting called Colors for a Large Wall, which were made directly out of this, where he made a whole series of 12 by 12 inch color monochrome panels and arranged them according to chance operations. Now there's another artist in this mix who never really met John Cage. What you're actually seeing is the encounter between him and John Cage, but who is deeply influenced by John Cage, and that's Gerhard Richter. As it happens, Gerhard Richter also involved himself in the process of random organization of color. He's made a whole body of work in which color patches are organized according to chance operations. And it goes from paintings he made in the 1960s to the stained glass windows he recently made for the Cologne Cathedral. And the Cologne Cathedral windows are enormously interesting and sort of unusual decision for the church. I think it made the bishop very unhappy. But in any case, they result in something that actually brings together a whole lot of different traditions, and they're wonderfully, wonderfully beautiful. But this is a picture of John Cage in an exhibition standing in front of Gerhard Richter's painting. And it's one of a group of paintings that Gerhard made where he just scribbled. And he chose a gray scale to do it in because he didn't want to have color symbolism be an issue. He didn't want to do black paintings or white paintings. He wanted to do paintings. And he also just scribbled because he didn't want to make gestures. In other words, he didn't want to make something that was understood to be meaningful in terms of its intensity of emotion or its direction, or in the case of de Kooning and others, its connection to figuration, its ever lessening connection to figuration. He just wanted to make scribbles that were scribbles, right? That were random, that were meaningless on purpose, that had no intent behind them. But of course, the removal of intent, as it is in Cage's Chance Operations, as it is in Richter's painting, and this is that basically the meeting between two artists who come from different places and did different things, but are in perfect accord on a few things, including this thing. That it is the understanding that you choose the arbitrary in order to correct the overdetermined, but you don't choose it in order to be arbitrary. You choose it in order to give your set a new sense of set of new variables. So here we go. I think this is a painting that Gerhard made for the Biennale that I curated, and they're called the Cage paintings. There's 6 of them altogether. And Gerhard met Cage, or didn't meet him, actually watched Cage on stage when he was a student at the Academy of Düsseldorf. And Cage came with a group of other artists associated with the Fluxus movement, which was an anarchistic, multidisciplinary cultural phenomenon. He really didn't know that much about what was going on in Western art. He didn't know that much about the avant-garde. He just was watching this thing and was fascinated by it. And he never met Cage. He just watched him in that one performance. But years later, he got really interested in music. He listened a lot to Morty Feldman. He listened a lot to John Cage. He listened a lot to composers of this generation. And for the paintings that he was making for the Venice Biennale, he started listening again to Cage. And so as he was painting, he was not painting about Cage, but he was painting in the ambience of Cage, if you will. And so when he finally decided what to title his paintings, he titled them the Cage paintings. He had previously made paintings based on Bach, and so on and so forth. But what you see here are a group of paintings which are made with a will to make a kind of painting, but also a will not to make another kind of painting. And the will not to make another kind of painting is precisely the will not to make this kind of painting, not to make a gestural painting. But to take it a step further even, because if this is the anti-gestural painting, in other words, the non-expressionistic, non-emotional, neutral, non-adex version of the gestural painting, then you do something else. You create a tool that denies gesture, but that gives you some of the painterly effects the gestural painting had given us. And so in this particular case, and I've got about 1 minute or 2 to go, so I'll wind it up. In this particular case, a man who did make the gray painting you saw before got rid of the brush and made himself an enormous squeegee, the kind that any of you who have ever done silkscreen will know, or for that matter, any of you who have ever cleaned your car window will know. It is a tool which makes a wide sweep and smears stuff. That's the, mostly when you're cleaning your car windows, you end up with a smear rather than actually a clean window. So what Gerhard Richter did was to invent a tool that could do this over an expanse of 6 feet or 10 feet even. And what you're seeing here is color applied to a surface and then squeezed against that surface with a squeegee, but there is no gesture. We are no longer in a world where it is, if you will, straight from the shoulder kind of expression. So this is a decision made to annul other kinds of decisions in order to annul other kinds of understandings that are based on previous conventions, but it is, of course, the invention of a new convention. And that's where I'm going to just sort of leave it in with this. The anti-part of any anti-art, of the anti-aesthetic, of Dada, whatever it is, does not abolish the complicated process of culture making. It simply shifts it somewhere else. And it immediately becomes a new set of conventions. And one of the biggest problems that plagues us, again, is this wide swing back and forth between the idea of the intentional and the unintentional, the reasonable and the anti-rational, and so on and so forth. Culture is always made where these things meet, and any radical gesture that disrupts them is designed not to settle it on behalf of this or that, but to reset the point at which the two come together and clash. That's it.